Hello, my name is William Lucas, and I would like to welcome you to the Triangle MLK conversation, Community Resiliency during COVID-19. This year, almost 400,000 individuals, we lost almost 400,000 Americans this year to this particular virus. Resiliency means bounce back, the ability to come back. The committee thought that it would be wise and prudent if we had a conversation to help our neighbors rebuild, not just from the medical perspective, from the economic perspective, and the other things that have devastated our community. So today, we're going to talk about how to come back. We can come back from this pandemic. We can come back from 2020 because we came back from 400 years of slavery. We are resilient people and we can survive. But today we're so glad and proud that we have experts who can really discuss these systematic issues that are plaguing and holding us down. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this wonderful conversation today. If we can pause for a word of prayer, and like I did earlier this morning, if we can just take a few minutes, just a moment of silence to remember those who we lost this particular year. God, we thank you. We thank you, first of all, for our very existence. We thank you that you were so powerful and so resilient that you allowed us to overcome the systems of slavery and the systems of Jim Crow and the systems of hatred and bigotry. And God, we have no doubt that you will bring us back from this particular system that's trying to hold us down, even the virus as it touches individuals today. God, we thank you for this panel of experts that we have. Please touch and guide them and lead them as they continue to just pour out and illuminate us. And I pray, God, that you allow us to glean from that knowledge and bless this program. Amen.
Thank you, Pastor Lucas, and thanks to all of you for your partnership. My name is Eric Ucan, and I am the CEO and president of the United Way of the Greater Triangle. We're honored to partner on this event today and really humbled to have the opportunity to do so. Our mission at United Way is to eradicate poverty and increase social mobility through the power of partnerships. Eradicate poverty and increase social mobility through the power of partnerships. And we have come to the conclusion that it is essential, if we are going to be an anti-poverty organization, for us to also be an anti-racist organization. And we have to look at the way in which we've done our work over the course of over 100 years, and we have to improve it. We have to think, and I appreciate how Pastor Lucas shared about the systems. We have to change the systems by which we operate at United Way and by the way in which our corporate partners and our nonprofit partners operate. We're not doing enough. We've put $7 million into the nonprofit ecosystem this year. We had a rapid response fund for COVID-19, millions of dollars going in. And we're proud of the work that we're doing in partnership with over 100 nonprofits. But we have to reimagine the way in which we do things and change the systems for the better. And most importantly, we have to work within the neighborhoods that we serve to not guess what the needs are or guess what the solutions are, but to actually be led by those neighborhoods. And that requires a change in dynamic and a change in power that I think is so essential to us coming out of this pandemic stronger than ever before. It's an honor to be with you here today. United Way of the Greater Triangle is honored to be in partnership with this, and it's an honor for me to introduce James White, who's a great partner with us at the YMCA. And thanks, James.
Hey, thank Eric, and thank you, Pastor Lucas, as well for your perspective. So, hello, everyone. Listen, we are in store and we're getting ready to engage a conversation. And I'm James White. As Eric mentioned, I'm an executive for the YMCA of the Triangle, so a pastor. I'm the pastor of Christ Our King Community Church. But then, thirdly, here's what I'm aware of that I am now incredibly human and human in a way that all of us are experiencing a reality to where I believe our humanity is being challenged no matter what position, what station we are in life, of what does it mean to be even more beautifully human. Here we are at a time period where we're going to be talking about a great deal. The title of this time is, again, as this morning, as Bishop Curry did an incredible job. And if you didn't have a chance to tune in, you will miss out. I would encourage you to go back and look. But Bishop Curry really set the stage for us in this idea that love is the way. And yes, as this is built, we're going to talk about sort of resiliency during this time of COVID-19. However, that resiliency is a reality that COVID-19 has exposed almost a convergence of many of the challenges that we have, a convergence of our economic, political, and social challenges, a convergence of our challenges around race, because certainly one can't enter into this conversation without thinking about what happened January 6th, without thinking about Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and then many others, even of note here recently in Texas as well. And so this is a conversation that's a critical conversation because we're still in the midst of this challenging time. Some say they're glad that 2020 is over, but 2021 in many ways is a continuation for a need for a new reality. You know what is interesting is that all of us, if for just a moment we would listen to Dr. King's words, and today Dr. King's words, what's fascinating and yet what's real is simply how prophetic his voice was. It was in 1968, just 4 days before he was assassinated, when he gave a sermon called Remain Awake Through the Greater Revolution. It was presented at the National Cathedral, listen to this irony, in Washington, D.C. He said these words: no individual can live alone, no nation can live alone. Anyone who feels that he or she can live alone is sleeping through a revolution. The challenge that we face today is to make it one in terms of brotherhood. And then these words, which many of us have heard: either we will live together as brothers or we will perish together as fools, because we are tied together in the single garment of destiny, caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. Dr. King named that no matter where we might be, no matter who we are connected together. And at the heart of those words is Dr. King's purposeful theme of love. That without love, there's no way we can create a unified society. Without love, there's no way we can indeed the world forward together. The lessons of Dr. King are often misunderstood. And what I love is that today you're going to hear from leaders who will make sure that, unlike many others, we've taken the words of Dr. King and turned them into sound bites without context. And so today we're going to have a chance to hear from panelists who I'm excited. Not only are they practitioners, but they're practitioners with a purpose that is a purpose that is often prophetic within itself, but have given practical solutions just from their lives as well. You will notice as well the advertising of this that we had William Barber III, because we really wanted to give a broad depth of thinking in this time, because that is required in the challenges that we're facing. But let's keep Mr. Barber in our thoughts and prayers, and that he was not able to join us for health reasons. But we do have Reverend Father Jamonde Taylor. Reverend Taylor is a community leader that really doesn't need introduction. He is, again, one of the leaders of One Wake. And just from my brief interaction with him, and even from his reputation, he is a scholar when it comes to race. He's a historian of the Black experience locally in other places as well. and he shepherds a congregation. He puts into practice those words of really one of the richest, lasting, influential congregations in Raleigh. We also hear from a person who as well is not just incredible, both philosophical and in her thinking, but Reverend Lisa Yaboa is really a practitioner that doesn't need an introduction. She's an organizer, she's a leader, and she is as well is this lifelong leader who understands learning and the research that it takes to make sure there's an intersection of both race and religion. Then finally, we have Dr. Duma Harshaw. Dr. Harshaw, and he wouldn't like this, but he's an expert when it comes to Dr. Martin Luther King. And one of the reasons why I'll give him that title is what I love about Dr. Harshaw is his humility deserves honor. But Dr. Harshaw is one who has actually journeyed closer to Dr. King than any of us on the panel today. He is one of the prominent leaders of one of the legacy building churches here in the Triangle, First Baptist Church. And he brings this very unique combination of being both a scholar, being both a pastor, but even facilitating those who are organizers to be transformative in our community today. So we are thankful that we have gathered this group of leaders for what I think is a very important conversation. Well, here's what I want to begin with. No one can deny that these are very challenging times. And I'd like to hear from each of the panelists that how do we remain authentic? How do we, and especially for us as pastors, because sometimes those who see us as pastors, we often have been sort of marginalized, and there are many who feel that do we really have a word that is practical and operational in light of the times that we're in? But I'd love to hear what is it that you are thinking, especially in light of January the 6th, because we can't leave that off the table. We don't want that to ever be an elephant in the room, but that along with COVID-19 has sparked our thinking. But I'd like to hear from each of you, what are you thinking as you journey as a leader in light of the times that we're in January the 6th and even Wednesday that is to come? So let me begin with you, Pastor Yaboa, first.
Thank you so much, Reverend White, for this weighty question. It's actually kind of multi-layered, and so I won't do my stream of consciousness and be here for 30 minutes trying to answer this question. I do think one of the interesting things about 2 Wednesdays ago on January 6th is that it was actually the 12th day of Christmas, which for some of us in the Christian tradition understand it to be the Feast of the Epiphany. It is a high and holy day for us as we recognize that Jesus is indeed the King of the world, the Messiah. These magi, sometimes represented in our nativity scenes as the wise men, come because they see the Messiah's star at its rising, and they move towards the gift. Now, Herod, who was the ruler at that time, when he hears about the star at its rising, becomes afraid and moves away from the gift, actually thinks the gift is a threat. Epiphany definitely felt different than I thought it was as a practitioner of faith in regards to what was revealed and how I watched in real time people not being able to see the gift of themselves as humanity being propped up by an ideology of white supremacy. I feel like, honestly, what looks like authenticity as we hold January 6th is how we continue to renounce the spiritual forces of wickedness. How do we continue to not have to become more slick or strategic in the ways in which we call out white supremacy, but when we see it, to just say it, and just that we don't have to be in a posture of convincing, but to just name the thing as it is, and then to ask ourselves, and what does it reveal? You know, what kind of epiphany is this? And, you know, we oftentimes heard commentators say, this isn't us, this isn't us, this isn't America. And I'm like, no, this is who we are. Nostalgia and amnesia are the great diseases of the American people, is that we don't know ourselves well. So I think to be authentic is to be truthful about who we are.
Well, thank you, Reverend Yeboah. Reverend Taylor.
Thank you, Reverend White. Always good to see you and honored to be on this panel. Your question on authenticity is most appropriate. When I think about authenticity, I think about really humus, which is the root we get humanity, which means from earth. In the Christian tradition, we believe that God created humanity from earth. So to be authentic is to be in touch with the person God created you to be. And a truly authentic person is someone who is well suited and feels comfortable, as it were, in his or her skin. When we talk about the moment we're in, particularly given what happened January 6th, I think it's important to read that event through the lens of history and realize that this is not the first time we've seen that, particularly here in the Tar Heel State. In 1898, there was a white supremacist really insurrection. White supremacists stormed Wilmington, ousted the duly elected mayor, ousted those people who had been elected, torched the Black community, and established their own government. It's certainly the only time in North Carolina we've had an event like that, and perhaps even in the United States. And so when we see what happened on the 6th, the breach of the quote unquote Temple of Liberty, we have as North Carolinians to say, well, that's part of our past. And so when we read these events, I appreciate Reverend Lisa's comment about revelation, what has been revealed. This is who we are. It's who we were in the past. It's who we are in this moment. And the beauty about the legacy of Dr. King is that we work toward the beloved community, that is working toward the greatest ideal and goal that we can live into his dream and vision.
So one of the things for those of you who are joining us, we also have a feature. If you have a question, please put that question in the chat. We will try to get to it. Here's why I bring that up, because already if you're listening, part of what you see is the power of this conversation is you have both Reverend Yeboah, who have really put things into a theological framework. But then you have Reverend Taylor, who's added a historical framework to match that theological framework. And so now I'm getting ready to ask Dr. Harshaw, what does Dr. King have to do with this conversation, both theologically and historically?
Yes, well, thank you so much. So honored to be here with my dynamic colleagues, representing a younger generation and being on target with the issues and engaged as pastors. And I preached a sermon in a partnership between Martin Street Baptist Church and First Baptist Church on New Year's Eve 2019, and was led to deal with the theme of staying woke, or staying aware of what is to come. Had no idea what was coming in terms of 2020, but I think we're living through a time that we really need to be keenly aware, with discernment spiritually, as to what is really taking place. It was horrific to see what took place on January 6th. And it was unbelievable in one sense, but believable, as my colleagues have articulated, in another sense. And if you go back and go through sift through the history of insurrections and this kind of mob protest, it is really part of American history when it comes to the Black community. It's happened again and again and again. In 1900s, it was awful. And Dr. King represents both the sense of awareness and dealing with truth and standing in his place in history and speaking truth to power and not hiding the discrimination, segregation, white supremacy, racism, and the discord among the human family, but in particular in North America and in the American society. He stood on the revelation of Scripture. He proclaimed from the pulpit in the spirit of the love and ministry of Jesus Christ and the power of the resurrection. But he faced evil as we have said, he faced evil. And so we can't put our heads in the sand and try to then redefine what we saw. What we saw as a sickness and pathology in the United States of America that has been there with different kinds of manifestations and has been really nurtured in the last 4 or 5 years to come out of the darkness into the light. And Dr. King knew that the battles that he was fighting were not only natural, but they were also spiritual battles. And so we need to be armed and ready, strapped not so much with automatic weapons in our role as spiritual leaders, but really strapped and empowered with spiritual resources of faith and prayer and the Spirit of God in order to do the fighting that needs to be done for this time in history. And he has provided for us a model of engagement, not sitting on the sidelines, but really engagement, involvement, showing up, being present. And so he inspires us in that way for the current circumstances that we find ourselves in.
So each of you have really communicated some very heavy, complex truths, and truth that at times can sound very difficult to engage. And Dr. Harshaw, you concerned me when you talked about being strapped. I didn't know where you were going with that. So I want to begin with you, Dr. Harshaw, because this whole conversation is around love. And really, King was really strapped with love and engaging love. So, Dr. Harshaw, how does King's ideas of love fit within this conversation today?
Well, if I might, I do a narrative in a sense. My first spiritual encounter with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. occurred on a hot summer day in August on the 28th in 1963. I was 12 years old, and I saw my father, Dumas Sr., sitting at a black and white television set, sobbing like I've never seen him cry before or since. And he was listening to a young black preacher address the nation while thousands were hanging on every word for the I Have a Dream speech. And it took me some years to really process what all of that meant. As a teenager, I didn't fully understand that message. I was mesmerized during that time by the spirit of protest in the 1960s, listening intently to the voices of Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale and Stokely Carmichael, H. Rap Brown, the Black Panther Party, the Black Power movement, Ron Karenga and us, and Malcolm X. And I had a spiritual conversion, which brought about then a conversion of thought and ideology. And then I began to listen to and I embraced and grew to love the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. because I saw him in line with the spiritual movement of Jesus Christ and how love could be applied more than a sentiment, but it could be applied to social ills and social evils, and particularly with the whole problem and the burden of America, which some have called the original sin, and that is entrenched deep racism. And so it awakened in me another kind of understanding. And in order to engage like Dr. King did, there needs to be an awakening spiritually, because it's so easy to pick up the gun. It's so easily to be about violent protests. It's so easily to give back what your enemy has given to you. But he knew that Jesus had a better way. And so through the years, I've tried to understand the message and the messenger and what he sought to do. And it has become a tremendous inspiration for engagement and fighting. And it doesn't mean that it's easy. And anytime you talk about applied love, like applied ethics, it goes beyond theory into practice. And there are challenges and difficulties, and it's not that easy. But it calls for a lifestyle of endurance, seeking to understand the implications of love and what it means for us to come together. And I think he was right on target. If we don't learn to love each other and live together as sisters and brothers, well, then we will perish as fools. And so he became an extraordinary model for that for me, and still speaks to me profoundly.
So first of all, let me just pause here and say, Dr. Harshaw, this is a rarity for those who are watching this to actually hear from someone who's had a lived experience with Dr. King. And so thank you for sharing that narrative and story. Reverend Yaboy, you give leadership and you influence those who are younger, who even after hearing Dr. Harshaw's words about love, feel that we're in such an environment of hate, such an environment of aggression, that love feels too passive. Even though Dr. Harshaw just communicated some ideas about love from Dr. King. Reverend Yaboy, I'm curious, we're curious, how do you help a younger generation understand that Dr. King's method of love is really a valid method in light of the world we're in today?
Yeah, I'm going to maybe answer that in an expansive way to say, I think when I'm speaking to younger generations about like the radical nature of love, I want to speak to everybody about the radical nature of love. I think in many ways, whether you are an older adult or young, there's some ways in which we have abdicated our responsibility and commitment to not thinking of love as being woo-woo, because love oftentimes is not anchored in an ethic, because oftentimes the way we talk about love, it's not anchored in practice. We can take the watered down version of love as our standard. I mean, we talk about we love food and we love the weather, but the love that Dr. King talked about, it was always willing to cost you something. It was not inconsequential love. It was a love that casts out fear. It was a love that disciplines our bodies to bend towards justice. And so I would say that when I talk about love in greater context, and also too when I challenge myself to not abdicate responsibility to radical love, is to imagine love that takes risks, is to imagine love that's tethered to just policies, to imagine love that disrupts our patterns of consumption. When we attach love to the things that are right and are righteous, we begin to recognize that love is not woo-woo. that love is incredibly powerful. I mean, again, coming out of the Christian tradition, we say God is love. Well, God can move mountains. God can create and recreate. God restores. God redeems. That means I attach love to all of those things.
Reverend Taylor, can you respond, especially in light of your context and in light of some of your passions, as to this whole message of love and how we can hear it and know as both Reverend Yaboy and Dr. Harshaw, they put a very active reality to it. But can you add more to that, Reverend Taylor?
Absolutely. As we think about Dr. King and the concept of love, he described love as the most powerful and ultimate force in the universe. In the Christian tradition, we believe, as Reverend Lisa said, that love begins with God, that actually God is love. And so the reason we are able to love is because God loved us. I think Dr. King's analysis of love is so powerful in his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. And he talks about love and power. And he lays out this argument that traditionally people have thought that love is actually the absence of power. And he's saying that actually love and power, to some extent, are on the same level. That historically love has been thought of as the resignation of power, and that power as the denial of love. The power and love combination, I think, is so important because when we think of power, most people have a negative relationship with power. That's because their experience has been unilateral power, oppressive power, power over. This is the power of white supremacy and its derivative racism. But when we talk about relational power, power among people. This is what we saw in the civil rights movement. That was power among people. Did not take up arms. People coming together to change laws and change corporations. That is the power of love. And so when I think about Dr. King and talking about love, we have to also talk about power. And as Dr. Harshaw and both Reverend Lisa, this is not a sentimental view of love, but actually power that enables you to do more than you could even think or imagine. I mean, imagine 1954 in this country, being the mother of Emmett Till, sobbing over her son's casket, saying that as Jesus Christ was to this world, Emmett Till would be through the United States. And we can really draw the line of transformation from Mamie and her son Emmett Till through today. Now, that would have been unimaginable for that woman, that young woman in Chicago, to look at the casket and somehow think that what happened to her son would be the catalyst of change. But that's love. That is power. That catalyst that allows us to do what is unimaginable, what we think is impossible. As Reverend Lisa said, God can move mountains. Well, the mountain of segregation and the mountain of white supremacy and the tide of white supremacy are huge, and yet we're moving them. And so when I think of Dr. King, we have to talk about love and power in the same context, not unilateral power, oppressive power, but relational power among people.
So each of you have mentioned words and ideas that for those of us listening can sometimes think they're distant. You've mentioned again about this idea of love and activism, and you've even mentioned white supremacy, and you've used other words that can catch some of us off guard. But for those who are listening, how does all of what you have just been saying, and I want each of you to tackle this, how does this affect us here in the Triangle? How does January 6th affect us here in the Triangle? How does, again, this idea of a need for a new kind of unity and love, COVID-19, how does all of that affects us right here?
Yes. But what seems to me, one way it really moves us again from the notion of being a spectator to being involved in what is really happening. And it's so important, particularly for people of faith, to then get involved, or to put their hearts and their spirits, to put something in the game, in a sense, and not just give your opinion on social media. One of the ways that my understanding of Dr. King was elevated was not just by reading books, but really engagement in the struggles in South Central Los Angeles during perilous times, and being engaged with faith leaders. Did a talk one time on remembering Martin with the Interreligious Council of Southern California that grew into an annual MLK prayer breakfast. I was honored to be able to work with some of the lieutenants around him during the movement, and meet so many of the people, including his family members, who were part of his ups and downs and struggles and challenges as he sought to exercise that love. And with Reverend James Lawson, who I worked with, who was the minister who invited him to Memphis, where he died, and also with the Reverend Dr. Thomas Kilgore Jr., who knew Dr. King as a little boy, used to bounce him on his knee, and was part of the Montgomery Improvement Association when it was birthed, and then had the honor, because of their tutelage, to serve as a member, but also the chairman of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference of the West in Los Angeles. And I just use those examples of we have to help people who think they can be involved by their feelings or emotions or observing something on television or writing a check, that this movement was successful because people changed their schedules, got involved, created a list of priorities, sacrificed in order to do that. And that's the other part of love. Not only, and we've talked about love and power and love in the gospel, and all of that leads us to love and sacrifice. And it's modeled in the heart of Christianity, because as loving as Jesus was, he died on a cross
Mm.
and rose again the third day. And love can look like that. And so Dr. King died, and as a result, he has given a message all over the world. I never will forget working for international ministries and traveling to different parts of the world. And in those days, I was still grieving the assassination of Dr. King and wrestling with God in my mind. Well, why would you allow this to happen? And then sometimes I would go to places like when I went to the Soviet Union and with a group of visitors there and the young people who talked about their own history, but particularly they knew the history of the United States probably better than we did. And as we were leaving, they said, well, we have a gift to give to you. And they began to sing, We Shall Overcome, and went into the heart of the Congo and saw pictures of Dr. King, and going to South Africa and spending time with Nelson Mandela and him saying that he was inspired by the movement. And all of this is, again, an example of the practicality and the engagement of love. Love is more than a feeling, but love is a verb. And I'll stop there so I don't go on and on. I am a preacher.
You all are. You all are. Let me just say this. You all have been doing incredibly well, but I would love for Reverend Taylor and Reverend Yeboah to tackle this question of, again, what does that mean for us here in the Triangle? What do these times mean for us here?
One of the things we have learned in these two pandemics, I call them two pandemics. One is COVID-19, and the other is the rise of white supremacy, or actually the unveiling of white supremacy, is that we are all connected. I remember one of the first acts St. Ambrose did in Southeast Raleigh is that we actually partnered with First Baptist and Southeast Table, where Reverend Lisa is, and we served almost 500 people boxes of food, 20 to 30 pound boxes of food. And I remember one of the organizers said, you will see people drive up in cars that you would not think that a person who drives this type of car would need food. And yet that individual needs food. So we saw really a leveling of a deeper connectedness of humanity. People who before had never needed food at all because they can go to the grocery store because they had good paying jobs, found themselves without work and needing to go to the food bank and needing to come to St. Ambrose and get boxes of food, needing to reach out to people. And so it was really a connection of humanity. When you think about this West African idea of Ubuntu, I am because we are, meaning that I cannot make it without you. That is what we saw certainly with COVID. It's been a leveling. And then with the rise of the awareness of white supremacy, particularly around the George Floyd murder and Breonna Taylor murder, is that we see an unveiling. There have been people in this country, particularly people of color, Black people, who could easily see the history and read the current events and see that this was a problem. There were others in this country who were clueless and blind to the fact. And so this unmasking really unleashed protests around the world, to the Vatican, to Asia in the East, to South America, all around this rising tide of anti-white supremacy moment. So we in the Triangle are connected because we are with the rest of the world living in the midst of two pandemics. One is COVID-19. The other is an awareness of white supremacy and its derivatives, racism, sexism, homophobia, all of these things.
I kind of want to, yeah, I want to add to kind of the same vein of Dr. Harshaw and Father Taylor. One of my dear friends, I want to give her a shout out, Dr. Margaret Antoinette Brunson, put respect on her name. We oftentimes talk about how just over the course of this pandemic, 8 million new people in the United States have slipped into poverty, which means that right here in our own community, we know individuals whose lives were already stretched before the pandemic, both pandemics, and whose now lives have been exacerbated by the struggles of this pandemic. And then more individuals who are now living a life where their lives, it's fragile, it's really, really very fragile, living out of a place of scarcity as opposed to abundance. And I think that oftentimes, and I'm just going to use the triangle as an example. Oftentimes, in the midst of crisis or when things happen, we tend to move towards like acts of niceness and kindness. But in the face of these two pandemics, when we're watching, I mean, millions of people living as though there's not enough, when there is actually enough for everyone if we actually distribute it in a God-sized way. That niceness is not what we're called into righteousness. And I sometimes like to think that that righteousness is the love child of love and justice. It's when love is operating as its best self, is that everyone knows themselves as having enough, that no one is having to live out of a place of scarcity. So I feel like all these movements that have been kind of rising up, Father Taylor and I, and also Dr. Harshaw, we are a part of One Wake. I think about our friends Durham Can, our friends in Orange County, who are moving the needle from being nice and kind, compassion to justice. And that's the way in which we love. I mean, I can't say that I love my neighbors and not care that there's an eviction crisis. I can't say that I love my neighbors and not recognize that there are individuals who are now having to figure out how to settle into life living in a hotel because there's not enough affordable housing. Love, if I say that, God is love, that love is dynamic and powerful, then I have to believe that love is able to move in the places that we sometimes wring our hands, or in the places where we have created systems that cause people to not be able to live lives where they flourish.
Wow. So all of you have mentioned this term, and we only have a few minutes left, so I'm sort of giving you all some boundaries. But sometimes when we hear the word white supremacy, we often hear, okay, are you talking about good white people, bad white people? And are you talking about, wow, that's the problem, is this black-white divide, and we've got to deal with that? When you say white supremacy, can you give us just briefly, what do you mean by that, so that those who are listening don't misunderstand what you're talking about when you talk about that being part of our challenge today?
Yes, well, we're really talking about ideology that goes so far back in time, but a feeling that one group of people are superior over another and feel like the other is inferior. And that spreads into systems of government, housing, economic realities, education, healthcare. And then the person becomes stigmatized by being an other simply because of where you stand in terms of history and times and culture. And it's not a blame game in terms of making people feel guilty and all of that. It's just simply stating a reality that is part of the fabric of the creation of the United States of America. And the beauty and what has happened in this country in the last 4 or 5 years is that all of that has come to fore, but it's always been there. Now we can confront it, name it for what it is, and then deal with it. And lastly, because I know the time is short, Jesus had a model that we can follow whenever he dealt with what the New Testament called demonic presence or possession. He always tended to name it or have them to name themselves so that he could be particular in what he had to exercise or what he had to deal with in terms of spiritual battle. And I think that's what America is going through now. We got to name these things for what they are. They're not the only things, but they are so huge and impact every way we function in the world, in this country. So they have to be named, drawn out, dealt with, dialogued about, educated about, denounced, and then move on. And that's a process. And that's where love becomes ugly, but it becomes real when you have to deal with love that way.
Thank you, Dr. Harshaw. Did someone want to add anything what Dr. Harshaw said?
I think we need clarity to overcome confusion. Many times when people hear white supremacy, they think of white supremacist. They confuse supremacy for supremacist. A white supremacist is a terrorist, is someone who is a neo-Nazi, who is a member of the Klan, part of a terrorist organization. White supremacy as Dr. Harshaw said, is an ideology, a belief that one group of people, white people, are better than other groups of people. And we see that play out in our society when we look at racial disparities. Part of my research coming out of Christian tradition is that we can point to the Christian church, the Western Christian church, as being the birthplace of white supremacy. There were two papal bulls, two official documents issued by popes in the 1500s that allowed for the taking of land and the taking of people. So you objectify land, you objectify people. That's how we get the transatlantic slave trade, the taking of people, the taking of land, the taking of indigenous folk, the belief that one group is greater than the other. And this also births the concept of whiteness, which has as its root to dominate. You dominate people by taking them, you dominate land by taking it. Always dominion, which is an example of unilateral power, which is oppressive power.
You know, as you all were talking, there are a couple of questions in the chat that I think fit with the challenge of this conversation. And someone asked a question, and you all both mentioned this, that Dr. King demonstrated love to those who hated him, and yet it cost him his life. How do we protect ourselves when being in such an environment of hate?
Well, one thing, we protect ourselves by recognizing the cost of loving sometimes, and the cost of being authentic, as we have started out with, and what it means to be engaged, what I call a theology of engagement. When I took a class at Claremont School of Theology with Dr. Lawson, one of the lieutenants with Dr. King, who taught the principles of nonviolence to the young people and the students, he referenced Dr. King as a theologian of engagement, because there was a big discussion about systematic theology and whether he was a theologian. And I think we have to recognize that there's a cost to service. There's a cost even to doing good. And we can't answer the reasons why good people suffer. There's just no answer to that question, but it may be the reality. And yet you have to do, as Dr. King said, you have to find something worth living for that also will be something worth dying for. And that is in the hands of someone bigger than us, and it's in the hands of God.
Reverend Yeboah?
I think my colleague, Father Taylor, has something to say.
Oh, okay, Father Taylor.
I
love how you put each other on the spot. Go ahead, Father Taylor.
I know. I appreciate that. We know each other quite well. I agree with what Dr. Harshaw said. Love will cost something. Now, in the extreme, there is life. And as I tell my people at St. Ambrose, if we say we are Christian and if we follow Jesus Christ, then our road leads to the cross. Because that's what it means to follow Jesus. And so in the extreme example, life may be lost, but all of us will lose something. Something must die so that something else can be reborn. That's the regenerative aspect, at least as we see it in the Christian tradition. So it is tough to love. And as I tell my church people, we appeal to the humanity. One of the first things we do is to pray. We've had very spirited conversations in Bible study about it being challenging to love some elected officials. And we then enter this period of prayer because we believe that entering prayer, which is conversation with God, will change realities. And so, if we follow Jesus, if we follow love, we will lose something. It may not be our life, but something will have to die. Hatred, prejudice will have to die. And so the way we can go about loving those who hate us from a religious standpoint is to begin with prayer, by praying for them and then appealing to their humanity, because that's something we all share. As I talked about earlier with authenticity, humus, which is where we get the word human, which means of earth. We are all of earth. We're all created from the same substance. Even those who are non-religious and appeal to the humanist tradition, we all share a common humanity. And so we can appeal to that, to appeal to our common humanity as the starting place, the genesis of love.
Wow. So I have another question, and Reverend Yeboah, I'd like for you to tackle this one. One of the realities, especially with Dr. King talking about how we're tied together, this is why love is important. But yet, that means we're tied with people who have different views politically. How do you even engage with someone? And this question was, how do you engage even with people of color who supported the past administration? And now that divide, even with the new administration, isn't immediately gonna sort of bring the divide together. Some suggest we're more divided than we've ever been before. How do you really engage love with those who have a very different perspective than?
Yeah, this is a good question. I think it's important, and we've kind of said this, that love isn't necessarily affection. I don't have children, but for those who are guardians or who do have children, they'll sometimes say to love their child doesn't necessarily mean it always feels that you're just overflowing with joy for one another. Love is not always affection, but to Father Taylor's point, love does look like, how do I honor another person's humanity? And when we honor another person's humanity, we also honor where people are becoming. How people are being shaped, which means that we also then have to confront where we might have some malformation. So I would say that sometimes, let's say, whether it be in communities of color or those who are white, we have to interrogate where we have all been sipping from the cup of white supremacy, because we're all swimming in the waters, and it can either malform us, either to move in the direction where we're shaped by empire, or it moves us toward the direction of like being shaped in the image of the divine. So, part of loving one another is also inviting each other to live into the highest, kind of our better angels, like to live into our best selves, and to leave room for transformation, and also to leave room for change. I also think that one of the things that, Jesus says in the scriptures, like, love your neighbor as you love yourself. I think we have to be very careful to understand when Jesus meant that. It's like how you have regard for yourself should be reflected in the ways in which you have regard for your neighbor, unless you have a thin love for yourself. Or if your sense of self is marred, then I don't want that kind of love. Like, if you don't love yourself well, I'm like, let's work that out first. So I think sometimes in community, we have to hold each other accountable and be honest about the times when, as Toni Morrison would say, we have a thin love for ourselves, which is not love at all. So if I am propping up my identity and I've got some internalized racism that I haven't worked through, you know what? How I care for Father Taylor is going to be kind of janky, which means that I've got to do some self-examination so that my love is rooted in something, not in a false ideology, but in the divine. I think to love those you do not agree with is not an easy thing. And I think we have to also be careful to realize that there are moments when sometimes love looks like creating boundaries to protect ourselves.
Wow.
That it doesn't just look like becoming a self-martyr for the sake of community. That's a perverse kind of love. If I have to somehow die without any new life for the sake of community. So I think it's invitation and challenge, and a lot of self-examination so that we love one another well, because we also love ourselves well.
Amen.
Thank you. Someone else. Thank you.
Well, I don't know what else there is to say after that.
Okay, exactly.
But the only thing I would add to that, because I think that really is reflective of what Dr. King lived and died for and understood, but also the notion of dialogue and building bridges. And that's difficult work. And a lot of that is happening in the triangle. And there's an effort like I've never seen before beyond pulpit exchanges or those kinds of things, to really get at talking about the difficult issues related to difference and being an other. But that dialogue is really critical. And with that love that Reverend Lisa just described, you can't lose, because change will come. It comes in our personal relationships from that, but also in our social relationships.
So here's my question. Tell me right now, tell us what's giving you hope, especially as part of your role is to communicate and to teach and to lead and to shepherd people to have hope. What is giving you hope?
Well, the theme that we are working with at First Baptist Church, 101 South Wilmington Street in Raleigh this year, is faith and not fear, always remembering that all things are possible, or that we believe in a God of hope, in essence. And God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of love and of power and of a sound mind. And so that's where the hope is. God changes people, God changes nations, and God changes us. And that's where the hope is. So you go on in faith, knowing that this too shall pass, but this too shall change.
Reverend Taylor?
I'm hopeful when I see people responding to the truth. Things that people have been saying, particularly Black people, for decades, for centuries, and it's been dismissed as somehow untrue. Now there is conversation. You can look at white supremacy. You could do a word search on media, the number of times that term was used 3 years ago versus last year. And I'm sure two magnitudes difference in the number of occurrences, people becoming familiar with this term. And as Dr. Harshaw said, we have to name it in order to call it out and see transformation. And also, what I think coincides with that is given an opportunity for Blackness as a concept to be embraced. Blackness is not the opposite of whiteness, brother. Blackness is this ever expansive ability to welcome and to love. And that is what Dr. King did.
Amen.
Thank you. Reverend Yeboah.
Yeah, I think we're very similar to both of my colleagues. One, I'm finding hope in people being honest and transparent enough to want some radical healing for their lives, which means, interrogating sometimes the construct of whiteness, or recognizing where racialized trauma has created limiting beliefs, and folks being like, no longer, I'm going to live out of a place of abundance. That gives me a great level of hope that we're believing in our humanity tethered to something other than just a myth. And honestly, with work, with One Wake, and just some organizing, and not feeling like we have to do anything alone, but we can leverage one another's power. That's giving me hope that we're not doing justice and love work in silos, but we actually believe I can't do this unless I'm also doing it with you. So seeing my triangle community being a holy fulcrum for each other, that we're leveraging our goodness, and actually believing that this world can look different, living with a holy imagination. This is not the best it can get. There's better. And moving toward that direction. It gives me hope.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let me just say, first of all, you all have given us hope. I hope by now there's a couple of things that have happened to those who have listened. One, my hope is that you would see that what you have heard in this last hour is worthy of your sending, passing on in social media, sharing, because I feel like we've had a rare experience. I feel like part of that experience that we've had is some often discredit the voice of pastors today. And I'm thankful that you've heard from 3 leaders who are not just leading from pulpits, but they're leading from the marketplace. And what I'm thankful for is that each of you have shared ideas and thoughts, and there's a part of me ready to come and be a part of your congregation. And I'm a pastor, so that's not good. But here's what's beautiful about that. I can be a part because each of you can be reached online. I would encourage those who are listening to know that part of what you've heard today in the spirit of Dr. King, that I think we've forgotten, that there is a moral, philosophical, practical framework that can come from those who lead in spiritual communities. And I'm thankful that each of you, though, are where you are because you value the voice of others, even those who are outside of your community. So I know that I speak for others, that we're just thankful for this conversation today. I want to close from something that Dr. King said very early when he first engaged this whole conversation. And this was in Montgomery at a mass meeting. And King was saying that love is really which corrects what revolts against love. He said that love is repair of harm. And that part of what we do when we love is that we create spaces that heal the wrong. And that is justice. So I'm thankful that today we had a conversation about love, but really a conversation about justice. And I'm also thankful that, again, for each of you, you give us all hope that Dr. King's perspective, Dr. King's ideas, Dr. King's life, his dream, because you've reminded all of us that Dr. King is far more than simply a speech he made in 1963. He's someone who gives us ideas that are relevant in the world that we live in today. So thank you all again for your time. And thank those of you who are listening. I hope that you've caught the spirit of King and that you're motivated to become a part of the movement. Remember, Dr. Hartshaw said, you can't sit on the sidelines. You all have a good day and let's continue living and working in the spirit of love. Thank you.
Amen. Amen.